I've found through my own podcast that you just get a different vibe with a real live conversation, and it's a little more personal and a little more exciting.
I think so. And also, I'm not even sure where one is headed. I mean, I sent you some questions for this talk, and thank you for taking the time. But we can start. I mean, I'll just tell you where I'm coming from. That when we talked before, I'm just mystified by the kind of gap between this huge world of critique and analysis of all the things that are wrong with capitalism, with financial systems, with the crisis generally, versus the rather modest amount of available information about what are we supposed to do.
Well, I mean,
Outside normal.
I have a, I have a theory on that because I've come through that. What shall I say? That storm, in the sense that I think academia, for starters, it's a more morally safe thing to do, to be critiquing and to presume the high ground and just throw it out to the world. It's much harder to actually build, create, experiment, make yourself vulnerable, fail. And in fact, the foundation world is complicit in all that, in that they sort of want deliverables and they don't want to do long-term speculative investment. And they don't want to experiment as much, even though they like to say they do. So, I think that the left itself, similarly, is so state and policy and law focused, important as those are, that they don't want to step off in new directions because it doesn't add to their brand franchise of managing the NGO. So it's kind of an orphan about the only people who create are those on the fringe who have an itch they need to scratch or have extraordinary leadership and commitment. That's my theory.
Yeah, it's a good theory, and I think we can come back to that. But I didn't want to go too far without my first prop, because I have had this book in my possession for a number of years, but it was published in 1939. It's
You've got
about mutual aid. It's one of the first of the Pelicans. It's like a penguin book from that period, even older than me, which is pretty impressive. And it was written, I think, in 1902 originally by this kind of traveler and naturalist. And when you said just now that, for example, foundations are not really committed to something new, my first question to you is, how new are these, not the critiques, but also the alternatives that you write about and that you advocate for, if in the context that Kropotkin is writing about what for him were primordial behaviors in animal societies of sharing and cooperating, and he refers also to kind of social histories from when he was writing in 1902. So how much of it's new, David?
Well, I think that it's frankly part of the human condition to cooperate and to provide mutual aid, as he described. And I think a lot of evolutionary scientists who are getting out of the individual natural selection into group selection are starting to understand that too. People like E.O. Wilson and David Sloan Wilson and Martin Novak and others. And we have a human propensity to cooperate. Well, of course, we have competitive and less appealing violent tendencies too. There's this huge propensity to share and cooperate, but we don't necessarily have the institutions to foster and encourage and facilitate that. And, capitalist modernity is kind of an aberration in the long sweep of human history in terms of enforcing this competitive individualism that is socially disintegrative. And I think a lot of people are trying to sort of turn that corner and build different types of institutions to validate and extend our natural propensities to cooperate.
So I don't want to come across as kind of a mad anti-state extreme libertarian, but Kropotkin did say that he had seen in animals a propensity, as you put it, to collaborate and to help each other, and they have no institutions at all. So is what we're missing institutions, or is it something else?
Well, I think when you, first of all, we are born into we are dropped down into these working civilizations that have built these complex systems based on, I think, some alternative logics. And of course, cooperation, trust, sharing are important to those systems too, but they're generally co-opted for the greater glory of the state or capital. They're not necessarily given their own autonomous space to grow and be respected. And I think that's what a lot of my work in the Commons is about, is trying to, first of all, make visible and then help explain in a deeper way what's going on in these alternative cooperation-based structures, which, as I say, are ultimately, I think, threatening or challenging to state power and capital. And part of the issue is both creating them so they function, but then doing so in a way that capital and the state don't simply override and prey upon them or co-opt them.
So this is, to use the word making visible just now. And to me, there's a big difference between making visible practices that are already happening somewhere, either today or in the past. And you wrote somewhere else, the best way through the crisis is to reimagine systems of provisioning and governance. So I don't want to be fancy about words, but is there a difference to you between making visible and reimagining, or are they alternatives, or do we need to do both?
Well, we need to do both. I mean, to the extent that I consider them a default mode of governance and provisioning in the human species, they've existed for a long time, but our cultural discourse, at least in the West or the North, doesn't acknowledge them. We've been trying to foist capitalist development plans on the global South for decades, and they frankly have their own systems, thank you very much, which are arguably more ecologically benign and climate friendly. So one is making visible, but to the extent that we are in this complex capitalist, globally integrated system, we need to make it visible and culturally validated that there is this alternative. And that, strangely, is a political act because it flies in the face of the dominant capitalist progress, modernity narrative. So, yeah. And so it's about imagining how within that context, we can create durable, functional, alternative cooperative systems.
So I just had this discussion with some friends in the last 3 or 4 years about whether the alternatives have to be conjured up out of our minds in some kind of frenzy of thinking very hard, or whether maybe we should get out of our room or out of our box in some way and go and look at what people are already doing. So I'm guessing from what you're now saying, it's not like an alternative, but making visible includes things that we wouldn't otherwise come across in our daily lives, but even connecting with things that are not too far away from where we are now.
I think it's a practice-based experimentation and evolution that has to happen. I mean, I recently read a piece about, this sounds arcane, but practice-based epistemology. Certain types of knowledge only emerge through practice. Through kicking the beast, through experimenting, through failing. And I think that's what a lot of commons do. And a lot of, you could say that indigenous peoples systems have been innovating for millennia and have come to a lot of stable, successful solutions. So, I think that's sort of what we need to do, is honor some of these practice-based projects, as opposed to thinking we can just come down like Moses from the mountaintop and say, here's the blueprint. I think it's about getting into the swim of it and seeing how you can move things forward.
This is so fascinating because you're the second person this week to use a word which I've never understood, called praxis or practice-based learning. And I think that a lot of people are coming to that conclusion from many different directions, is that we talk about we're living in a knowledge-based society, but actually we're living in an information-based society, but we don't really internalize or embody this knowledge very much, and it becomes almost a kind of source of stress that we're told so many things, very hard to filter and very hard to choose priorities.
Well, there's this conceit that knowledge is this deeper theoretical thing that then we have to transfer to others to apply, the practitioners to apply. when in fact, I think that a lot of that knowledge is simply dead, sterile, fixed, as opposed to the dynamic kind of knowledge that practitioners have from actually implementing something. And I might add that there's a whole social dimension of generativity as people interact with each other, open source style, or in a community where certain types of knowledge that's embodied or place specific emerges, that the top-down knowledge that purports to be universal and natural doesn't capture. And so I think there's kind of this deep epistemological clash going on about what knowledge counts and how to make it effective. And I think you see, interesting enough, in a lot of the big tech world designs of software, they've had to come to terms with this ontological reality of what is knowledge, what works. And a lot of the top-down stuff, they've had to surrender to the bottom-up improvisation and experimentation to see, well, that's what works.
So this is, to me, one of the reasons I'm so happy to have this conversation. Forget the dog barking in the background. That he's not commenting on your comments. Don't worry, David. So he's not that well trained. But this notion of there are certain people who have the temperament and the talent and the capacity to think about things very deeply. But there's a kind of gap between that world and the rest of the world who are busy kind of having daily lives, and all the pragmatic sort of difficulties of children and jobs and pressures don't have the opportunity to think deeply. And so I'm curious about how you bridge the people who know that things could be different and maybe even know how they could be different, and the rest of us. I'm halfway through, obviously, but the rest of the people who don't have that opportunity. Have you thought about this?
Well, a lot of my work life is precisely being a kind of ambassador between the practitioner world and trying to give it a larger generalized conceptualization so that we can talk about it in a more generalized ways, as opposed to that's a one-off aberration that's interesting, but it doesn't have larger implications. And I think that's one reason that I've gravitated to the commons discourse, because it's spacious enough to encompass a diversity of different types of commons, yet it acknowledges the importance of context and particularity, whether it's geography or history or culture, in forming these alternative forms of provisioning. So you can see these commons in everything from farmlands and fisheries and wild game to urban settings, to digital settings, and so on. So I find it endlessly fascinating trying to connect what's going on the ground to some of the more larger generalized, I don't want to use the word theory because it seems so arid and abstracted, but certain generalized lessons we can learn from these on-the-ground practices.
Well, the reason, the work of yours that I found most inspiring for 5 or 6 years, this is a copy I printed off of the cover. It's a report of a meeting, I think, basically, about, sounds very theoretical and very abstract, reimagining value, but it's been very inspiring to me because it connects the word value, which is, and what does that mean? The subject of money, which is also clearly important but clearly abstract, to things like care, that is the work that people do to look after each other, for looking after their places. Or, as you just said, the work that we do without necessarily being paid or recognized on the internet and so on. So that is what you would be, being an ambassador from a kind of the critical side of things into the everyday life of other people, the broader population.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things I need to say. One is, I think that if you can approach social phenomena with a different lens, the way quantum theory or Darwinism changed everything by giving a different conceptual framework for looking at things, different things pop out, different possibilities emerge. And I think that was part of the inspiration for that. We had a so-called deep dive in cooperation with David Graeber, the late anthropologist, who had thought a lot about these issues and actually had written a book early in his career about value in an anthropological sense. And I think it's very timely and relevant today because market price, which is so beloved by capitalism, is seen as the only serious indicator of value. And so price equals the value of something. But of course, we know that value in our lives has a much richer multiple meanings, whether it's ecological or social or intergenerational or simply care, as you mentioned. So we wanted to develop, we aspired to create a new theory of value, or at least understand better how we might approach that topic. And it's dear to my heart because I see all of these commons as enacting different forms of value in practical ways without the price system, except as a peripheral tool. So the idea was to reimagine value and think about how social systems create value without market transactions, without prices. And is like such a heterodox idea, like you don't have prices or transactions and you're creating something that's valuable. But I think that's the reality of human life, and that's the reality of ecosystems.
So one of the people that you write in this publication, David Graeber, wrote a book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. So one of the fundamental questions that bugs me is, if money has been around on debt for 5,000 years, how realistic is it to imagine escaping from that or occupying a different world in which money doesn't become the only measure of value? And if I understand correctly, the commoning, the things that are held in common, has also existed for thousands of years, but it's being kind of written out of the story. Is that one way?
Well, let's just stipulate that 5,000 years is a bit of a deception in terms of capitalist money, in which the tools for aggregating and centralizing and accumulating wealth, which then spilled over into political power, is a relatively recent phenomena in the long sweep of human history. And, so yes, money has often been a very paralyzing tool, and debt especially, as Graeber pointed out. But I think, as Karl Polanyi points out in his book, The Great Transformation, usually society, whether traditional societies or indigenous societies, or sometimes monarchies or empires, the social concerns were not trumped by money in the way that capitalism is the divine right, the divine goal of power these days. So we've seen some of the pathological and ecological effects of raising money, especially debt and equity, as the key drivers of value. But so you're right, money has been a source of harm over the centuries. It's more the exchange value that money allows that's been put on steroids in the past 200 years that's so harmful, at the expense of use value, which has this richer sense of human, social, and ecological value.
So if there's anybody watching this who's thinking, oh my goodness, money has been around for so long and there's no escape from money, that's because I'm asking the wrong question. It's money and means of exchange have always been useful and always will, but what capitalism does is to kind of make things interchangeable and tear them out of their context, the notion of a commodity or things that can be traded anywhere in the world as a kind of an abstract thing. That's not just about money.
It makes that the governing principle for society and politics, as opposed to something that is controlled by the larger society, where, in medieval times, yes, there were lots of markets, but markets were often stinted, meaning there were certain limits on what speculators or others could do within those markets, because they realized the socially damaging impact of that. So markets were kind of kept within bounds, you might say, inframed by social communities more than they are today, where, for God's sakes, you have money re-engineering the genome and human life forms and claiming property in snippets of sound and smells and images in a way that was impossible in previous generations.
And it's so important because I read somewhere that Confucius, there were Confucian rules for running markets, and Ethiopian farmers markets hundreds if not thousands of years ago. So what you're explaining is that the capitalist forms of exchange are relatively recent, a couple of hundred years, maybe a bit more, and that they probably, for sure, the reason we're in a crisis is that they've run their course, and therefore the discussion is what's going to take their place. And that's where, I guess this is where I introduced the third part of this conversation in terms of the book, because I was so keen to understand where you stood in terms of criticizing the system that surrounds us versus introducing us to alternatives. And so I don't want to put words into your mouth, having just done that, but tell us what the thinking behind the Commoners Catalogue was, the Commoners, which is your new book out basically just now.
Yeah, it just came out a couple months ago, and it's my attempt to disgorge from my past 20 years of experience in looking at commons the wide diversity of functioning commons in all sorts of different contexts. There's 25 different thematic categories that the catalog looks at, but they're all sort of these positive, constructive alternatives to capitalist markets in meeting needs. So we're talking about land and food and housing and software and energy, social care. And it's my attempt to sort of show, there's a lot of things to be hopeful and optimistic about if you know where to look. And I was inspired by the Whole Earth Catalog from the 1970s, which did this in the pre-internet age of providing dozens of examples of back to the earth alternatives that were frankly groovy and a way to get out of the perceived trap of capitalism as it was girding its strength in the 60s. And of course, from the 80s and beyond, as neoliberal type capitalism of the Reagan-Thatcher variety kicked in, we've seen the noose tighten. So in that spirit, I wanted to pull together my favorite examples of different successful commons out there while providing web links and books and other resources for people to follow up on.
I want to ask you about some of those in a moment, but it's this notion of what's different about now from the 1960s and 70s when the Whole Earth Catalogue was having such a huge impact. Why did it not succeed in turning the whole world onto these much simpler and more sustainable ways of meeting our needs? What went wrong, or did anything? Well, how do you explain that?
Well, I mean, I think that they were on the right track, but I think they were politically naive in the sense that they didn't develop the institutions or coherence as a movement to protect their gains from the co-optations and raw power, political and economic power of capital. And I might add that some parts of the Whole Earth Catalog, like Stuart Brand, who was the editor, have proven to be kind of libertarian techno-solutionists. He's a big proponent of nuclear power, for example. And I think a lot of them didn't necessarily have a more collective political vision. It was, in some ways, you might even say consumerist, in that some of the stuff featured in the catalog were, buy this great gadget or tool, which, of course, we need access to tools. The markets are often important for that. But I think there was an element of consumerism involved as well.
So this is so this is also called a catalog. That was called the Whole Earth Catalog. This is called, what is different about this in terms of how the reader should relate to it? In terms of, do you consume these various solutions, or what do you do with them?
No, I sort of see it as a sampler for people to gain access to these diverse models. It's not asking anybody to buy anything except perhaps books. And many of those books are actually free online, and the websites are free online. No, it's more about getting involved socially and collectively to make change. and to show that there are many access points or on-ramps for people to do that, given your passion and talents. So it's not as if you need to sign up with movement central or headquarters to do X or Y. There's lots you can do where you live right now without government permission or funding. And that's sort of, I think, a liberating message that we don't have to necessarily right now work through the established systems, which we know are compromised or corrupt or inaccessible to ordinary people. And I think that that's sort of, I think, an important lesson if we're going to try to get out of the stranglehold that we're in.
So this is, I think, a pretty central point for a lot of the people that I meet and talk with. As soon as one describes an activity like an alternative energy arrangement, local energy, for example, or buying food directly from a farm, or taking children into the forest to connect with nature, they say, well, it's very nice for you to tell me about it, but my lifestyle does not allow me to do that. I don't have I either can't afford the prices from the farm, or I don't have the time to take my children into the forest. It's this notion of these alternatives being only available to prosperous white middle-class people who have the time and the resources to do it. I don't agree with that, but what is your answer to that? How do you answer that?
Well, I mean, I think that you're right that people with more money have more discretionary time or resources to explore some of those things. But let's not forget that commons are a time-honored survival vehicle, the way the whole mutual aid networks that sprung up in the midst of the pandemic were a way for people to meet basic elemental needs, and these were not wealthy people. So again, an example of how social collaboration can meet needs in very effective, rapid ways. And so I just don't buy that excuse that I don't have time. Yes, capitalism makes sure that we're busy. It seduces us with screen time on your iPhone or social media, but there are choices that we have that I think we need to nurture and make culturally attractive. And I think
this is one of the things that has opened my mind extraordinarily. I don't speak Spanish. I don't have much knowledge of traveling in Latin America, but the wealth of examples, not just in the Southern Americas, but also in Africa, of living systems of mutual aid right now are extraordinary. Hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, you write about some in this book, but there are so many living traditions out there. And it's almost that you think, well, you suddenly realize that we living in these rich countries of the North are just isolated from so much potential. And that's why this notion of getting awareness that lots of people are helping each other right now using relatively simple techniques which date back generations.
It reminds me of how in the previous French administration before Macron, the French Development Agency was actively, creatively exploring how it could change its development strategies in Africa and other global South countries by leveraging the commons that were already existing. In other words, not trying to impose a Western consumerist development model that would simply plug into the global trade system and then make those countries exporters of their resources or neo-colonial systems.
I know a bit about that project, David, because I was at a seminar with Amartya Sen's group, who was paid by the Sarkozy government to write a report about the well-being economy, or something like that. And I moderated a panel, and we had a very high pangendrum from the French finance ministry, the boss of it, saying and I asked him, what do you think about this alternative way of measuring value and getting rid of GDP, gross domestic product, and replace it with well-being? He said, I think it's an excellent idea, and I will add the well-being of the French way of life on top of the existing economy. And so, he didn't, I mean, he knew perfectly well what I was feebly trying to get at, but the notion that, yes, France is, I'm living and working in France for a long time now, is brilliant at picking up on opportunities and wrapping them up in very, very kind of grand packages, but at the heart of the machine doesn't change so much, I must say.
No, well, I mean, obviously, this is why many of these answers need to take root indigenously, domestically in the global South, and not have white Northern interpreters like me. Having said that, I know that a lot of those movements are starting to find their voice, starting to find their voice vis-a-vis international relations and trade, and assert their own epistemologies, as opposed to, they've complained that they've been victims of what they call epistemological violence, in which the global Western models have been imposed upon them with a great deal of cultural violence or dispossession. So a lot of the challenge, I think, is allowing a pluriverse to exist instead of the one world of global capitalism, and honoring those different ways of being and knowing and producing.
I mean, I'm completely with you on this because I was we've read books about pluriverses of the different kinds. And that's one of the things that you pick up on here is, I'm just looking for that, this notion that our task is not just to look after each other as humans, but the whole of life. And that is something which definitely comes from other cultural traditions outside the North and the West. The fact that we need to be aware of a living world and us being alive within a living world, connecting that value word with biological life and feelings of aliveness, which is something which has been so absent from the kind of modernity. So I agree that those voices are being heard, and people like us are having to learn to be far more respectful and far more silent, frankly, to let those voices be heard. How do you think people like us, white northern experts, can help that happen more? What could we do?
Well, I mean, I think among our cultural cohort, there's a lot of thinking and writing going on these days about, for example, the new animism, about understanding that the world is alive, not just in some sort of woo-woo sense, but in the sense that, well, as Bruno Latour, the French theorist, has pointed out, the climate has become a political agent these days. And the Earth is, in some ways, becoming a political agent because it's pushing back on the presumptions of capitalism. So I think that there are fissures, I guess, what I'm saying, in capitalist modernity, in which the reality of the Earth as a living system is starting to make itself manifest. The idea of Gaia is not simply a metaphor, it's a literal reality. And I think people are starting to see that human beings are not simply what they know or what's in their minds, there's embodied knowing. And, so I think these kinds of things are starting to percolate. The pandemic, I think, helped promote some more reflection. But in terms of what we can do, I think it's about becoming involved in these collective practices and comedy and having experiences that are not simply, it's not just reading a book, it's about doing and learning within these collective environments. And that changes one's understanding of how the world actually works, as opposed to what's served up to you at the supermarket or on social media by, big tech.
I mean, I've been criticized in the last year or two for being negative about, books and researchers and, people working in universities. But I must say there's a man called Stephen Harding, who is a kind of a white northern professor, but he wrote a book called Animate Earth, which totally blew my mind because he's a scientist and he explained what you've just saying, that, the Earth is it's a living system, multiple systems, but he just describes it in very scientific ways and then seamlessly sort of explains, and by the way, various other cultures have known this for thousands of years, but not using scientific techniques. So I just suddenly had this notion from reading a book of, science kind of coming together with indigenous and different cultural knowledges after hundreds of years of being very separate. And that's kind of happening now. And so if I can get it, then many other people can get it as well.
I will just mention 2 or 3 of my favorite books in that regard. By coincidence, I'm reading Stephen Harding's Gaia Alchemy, his latest book, in which he says if if Gaia is actually a physical phenomena of the earth and we are part of the earth, then there's a lot of stuff going through us that we need to tune into. And so he tries to marry Jungian psychology and the collective unconscious to our bodies and to our connections with the earth, and talks about medieval alchemists in a pre-scientific way, understanding this, trying to probe this collective unconscious. I won't go further. I haven't finished the book, but I think that's a really interesting and brave book that he's written. But other people that I find very compelling are people like Andreas Weber, the German eco-philosopher and biologist, who is all about embodied knowledge and how feeling and emotions are evolutionarily significant, not just some epiphenomena. And that he talks about biopoetics as being a way that different species communicate with each other through biosemiotics. I could go on, but the point is that I think there's a whole way of talking about living systems that science doesn't understand because it's just cordoned off some of these, what shall I say, affective dimensions of life that it regards as not consequential because it's, too embedded within the Victorian era industrial competitiveness model of Darwinism.
Well, I'll tell you what the other thing, because I wrote I'm waiting for my copy of Stefan Harding's new book. I'll put, by the way, these details in the box below this video. But the other thing, just completely, but I don't want to keep saying blown my mind, but it's true. There's a group called Microbes and Social Equity. A professor called Susan Ishak at the University of Maine and a whole 150 researchers around the world who are looking at what you were saying, that the human body is not isolated from the world, that a microbial life is kind of, our bodies are porous, microbial life operates at many different scales, and that what people, you see these things like pre-existing conditions. Why do people get COVID? These pre-existing conditions are to do with, amongst many things, the microbial environments that people live in of different social and economic situations, and that quite basically poor people live in diminished and or toxic environments, as a result of which, guess what, they have pre-existing conditions. But the notion of understanding microbial life as a form of social justice, I'd never thought of that clearly at all before. But there you have a worldwide group of researchers saying, we will go to a community where there is an outbreak of illness or whatever. We can then start to analyze the microbial situation, the total environment, and start to see if we can find contributing factors that, frankly, the medical system hasn't thought about at all.
Well, you could say that, that corporatized processed food is a massive biological experiment on humankind. And the whole biomes of people have been decimated or remade through not having whole foods and natural foods, and with a lot of health consequences that come from that. So you're right. This is sort of part of the whole process of recovering what life and aliveness is about, as opposed to simply being a consumer.
So you and I, as you know, I've done a lot of work. You've done a lot of work on food systems, which has always been a rather sort of abstract word and puts a lot of people off. But in terms of commoning and food and this word agroecology, you've got some examples in the book. What is your sense of how quickly that world is growing out of a minority interest for a few rich sort of Western people?
Well, as often happens, the rich become a vanguard because they can afford it or because it becomes a trendy thing. And unfortunately, a lot of those trends simply become the next shiny thing that is played with and then discarded. However, I think these have deeper roots in that a lot of the people realize that, first of all, the overarching sense of crisis is very different from in previous generations. And I think a lot of people saying we're in this for the long haul. And I also think that they realize that having this genuine relationships with the earth and with each other is what needs to be nourished, and that it is a very enlivening thing to do. So, that's why I think that community-supported agriculture and community land trusts, the slow food movement, agriculture and permaculture, which you mentioned, the whole localized food movement, which has had a significant impact on big ag, at least in their attempted co-optation of it, has all of this has had an enormous impact, and I think it's the way of the future. I think they can coordinate enough to become, let's just say, a political force and not simply be co-opted the way the 1960s and 1970s whole Earth community did. So we need a greater horizontal connection of translocal communities to say we're all in this together, even though you're in Kansas and I'm in New York and you're in Europe, because I think this is the paradigm of bioregionalism that needs to be fortified and strengthened, if only to do away with a lot of the carbon-heavy global supply chain issues.
I mean, I think those words really, I think, are pretty crucial, and I haven't heard you say those before, where we're in it for the long haul, because I think one of the biggest sources of stress and indeed burnout for many people is this constant reiteration of how extreme the crisis is. We've only got a couple of years to kind of turn some gigantic machine round, and that's been going on all my adult life. So the crisis seems to be self-replicating or never gets any better at all. But if one thinks of something like patterns of agriculture, industrial agriculture has really kind of 2 generations has kind of exploded in my lifetime, actually. And so we have to give ourselves 2 or 3 or 4 generations to regain this notion of small scale, local, low input, etc., that these words like agroecology describe. So is that something is that in your, I haven't seen in the book about time scales, how these, when these tools and techniques, what sort of time we should give them?
I think that, I wish this was a more coordinated, unified response. I think it's very local specific of what can be done in that area. And I don't think it is really coalesced in a broader scale yet. However, we've seen quite vividly how the existing big ag industrial machine on a global scale is falling apart, or the costs are getting higher and higher, or the supply chains are getting more fragile and fragile, especially as climate change kicks in more seriously. So I think there is definitely a gravitational pull to relocalize what that means, how you do it. This is stuff we have to invent or build upon the rudimentary models that we have so far. I mean, there's a number of interesting areas, like I think you in your book explored the Fresno food commons as an attempt to reinvent regional food chains. I know in Kingston, New York, there's serious efforts to convert this major tract of land that used to be involved in industrial agriculture into a more regional supply source. But, how this works out, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different types of experiments, but I think they add up to an unrecognized shift that if government officials were more far-sighted, they would get ahead of and start to
I tell you, David, I actually think that some of the biggest changes, I mean, food is always a good way to ground these things, are happening, not national governments. National governments at the end of the day are kind of not, they can't get it. But city and regional governments in lots of different locations are taking food far more seriously as a kind of their responsibility. And in 2 respects, not just in terms of providing calories to the people so that starving people don't come for them with pitchforks, which is a traditional and quite effective political lever, but also because there's a very quick growing recognition that food growing has all sorts of social and cultural and ecological benefits beyond keeping people from starving to death. And so in many, many cities are doing food plans of one kind or another, where they don't any longer say, we need metrics to prove that the calories that we grow in our city are the same as the calories you can buy from.
And having said that, yes, I totally agree with that analysis, because the national governments are either locked up or ideologically driven, and they can't innovate. The scale is too big, the corruption is too great. Having said that, there's a lot of cities that still are within the mindset of let's connect with commerce and build those infrastructures to promote it. And they can't quite turn the corner for these alternatives. I'm thinking of in Amsterdam recently, there was a big tract of land that the city wants to make into a distribution hub for, the Amazons of the world. And a citizen movement arose to try to put it into an agricultural park and crowdfunded several €100,000 to help buy the land. But the city was still dragging its feet and still couldn't quite say, oh yeah, you got a point and we want to help out. And I think this is the problem with both electoral politics as well as cities that depend so much on tax revenues to get out of the growth paradigm into something that is more regionally self-sufficient. It's a hard corner to turn.
It is, and this is something you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to ask you about, is this notion of mindsets, because at the end of the day, if people don't emotionally connect with living systems and a living world is more important than an economic one or a money one, then they will be inclined to take decisions based on money logic and GDP logic. So I think you're right about that, and what you see in the Netherlands is a good example of a very kind of rationalized country which is actually going mad, but at a kind of systems and government level in some respects. But I think that's partly because they don't have this embodied empathy for living things that many of their citizens do.
Oh, interesting.
And so they don't get it as individuals, and so the systems make these crazy decisions. What is how do mindsets change, David? What is your conclusion about that so far?
I mean, I wish I had a magic wand for where the mindset changes. I've often said that, the civil rights movement in the US relied upon church basements, and the women's movement relied on consciousness raising groups to speak in shorthand about it. And I'm not quite sure what the vehicles for people getting it in getting this new mindset is, but I find that it happens in all sorts of different ways. But maybe the crisis will just have to get more severe. Maybe there'll have to be more disasters. I'm worried that this is not just a left issue, because I think commons are trans-ideological in appeal, but I think the right tends to gravitate towards these authoritarian populist solutions, as we've seen. And I don't think the left has gotten out of its mindset the state is going to save us. I know some climate activists say to me that, well, we don't have time. Commons is very nice. All these system change movements like degrowth and transition towns, very nice, but we don't have time. Now, I understand that argument, but at the same time, it's been 30 years since it's been pointed out that climate change was approaching, and battering on the door of state power, law, and policy has not significantly changed things or given us a pathway for solving this problem. I think that finding ways to empower these alternative logics and mindsets is what's going to bring state power to the table and force a new reckoning or a reconfiguration of state power to support these alternatives, as opposed to short-term thinking that short-term so-called solutions will get us there, because they won't.
So you just said maybe the crisis needs to get more severe. I think don't say that too loudly, because I think many people think we have enough crisis just at the moment with war as well as the pandemic. Thank you much, Mr. Bollier. But I think that I'm always feel hesitant to articulate a theory of change based on lots of small things happening that may be invisible, that in some way or another connect up. But this sort of is my theory of change. But I'm sympathetic to those who say, well, this sounds feeble compared to, for example, a war in Ukraine.
Well, I totally get that. I mean, one of my favorite sayings is this Dutch or Belgian designer who said the next big thing will be a lot of small things. But of course, the challenge is how that happens. And I think that Stephen Harding, who we talked about, had a good point that in ecosystems, what often happens is that disruptive event that clears the decks and allows existing resources to be repurposed with a different logic that goes to a deeper, more benign level. And I think that, I'm not hoping for any disasters. I'm actually trying to avoid them. But I'm thinking that maybe when the inevitable disasters hit, as we've already experienced several, that will create both the cultural space as well as the systems space for innovations to emerge in a different logic. And I think that may be one theory of change, which is unfortunately based on catastrophe. But let's do our best in terms of within the existing systems, but let's have these other alternatives waiting in the wings to seize whatever opportunities or needs arise.
But I think it's coming back to where we're saying about how change happens, and this notion of imagination versus revealing. And somebody I admire, a design leader called Mugendi Mritha, told me many years ago about, I think there are 2,000 systems of mutual support of one kind or another in Africa that he knows about. In the different, he's from Southern Africa, and he said, this is what I know, that there are this incredible variety of social support systems that have evolved in their context over long periods of time, and many of them have not disappeared in the same way as the ones that you've talked about in Latin America and South America. So it's just that lots of small things are there for us to learn from, but maybe we're sort of stuck in the kind of in a particular situation where we're less likely to connect with them.
Yeah, and I think also you can paralyze yourself from trying to think through how these macro scenarios will unfold. I think the point is simply to tend to one's garden and possibilities within one's sphere of influence and personal life, while trying to develop these larger possibilities. The term that I often use is emulate and federate. You're not trying to replicate some blueprint, you're trying to emulate these others, and then you want to federate them so that they're in loose communication and support with each other, the way we've seen with transnational digital communities, whether it's Wikipedia or open source or open access publishing. And I think that is a model for allowing the pluralism and diversity of things that are rooted in their own soil to exist, but then to have a larger impact without becoming some centralized ideology or single movement.
I think this notion of federate is something, actually, again, it's not something we should need to wish for in the food world, which we were talking about. For example, the Open Food Network in Europe is a kind of open source information architecture for how do farmers sell their food to citizens in the city. This is as much a kind of an engineering and technology and service design question as it is about ideas or wishes. And it's very tough work, and they're starting from a low base. But there's dozens of groups all over Europe, for example, doing that hard work of building kind of architectures for the internet so that people can do what they need to do in terms of buying food from a farmer. But it's another example of where lots of things are just coming across into visibility. They're not yet mass phenomena.
And they can expand very quickly as the models are demonstrated. And we've seen, for example, how at least the cultural expression of Occupy spread around the world within a matter of weeks or months. And if there's proper tools, and increasingly certain digital tools can act not as a magic bullet, but as an essential enabler, I think these things can move fast, especially when existing institutions are either disrupted or distrusted, dysfunctional, or imploding. So, I think that we shouldn't try to spin too many scenarios that, it's going to happen this way. I think we just develop capacities that we can know are stable and can perhaps expand.
Yeah, I think this may be a good way to draw to a close today, David. I mean, one of the writers that has reinforced my modest confidence that large numbers of small things can have the change that we want, Amador Fernandez Sabater from Spain, wrote that, yes, we don't have a grand narrative for the times, but we do have 1,000 voices carrying out an incessant conversation, both on the streets and online. And I think that corresponds to my experience and your work also.
I think that there's this whole cultural latency that's waiting to manifest, and history gives us surprises for how that does manifest. So I think that we've seen that the loss of faith in existing narratives, especially the capitalist progress narrative, is waning. And there are all these others that we can develop that are far more credible, more grounded, and likely to get us where we need to go.
David, thank you. I will remind everybody that if you want to carry on learning from David Bollier, this book is just out and is very, very readable, beautifully designed, very accessible. Go and get a copy of that. David, thank you for your time. And
thank you, John. I appreciate the
always, and I wish you success in the next part of your journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. Bye.